Nena had been planning her son Samto's birthday for weeks. She didn't have much, but she poured all her love and effort into making the day special. She saved money little by little, cleaned the house until it sparkled, and decorated the small living room with colorful balloons and ribbons. She wanted her little boy to feel celebrated, even if the party was simple. Every detail mattered to her, from the paper cups to the music she picked. Her greatest joy was seeing the smile on her son's face, so she made sure nothing was left undone. When the day finally arrived, neighbors and a few friends came with their children. The atmosphere was warm, filled with laughter and chatter. Samto wore a neat shirt that his mother had ironed the night before, and his excitement filled the air. But soon, the mood shifted when Madame Ayanda, Nena's mother-in-law, made her grand entrance. She walked in with her head high, carrying the same arrogance she always displayed. Instead of greeting warmly, she frowned at the decorations, muttering loudly about how cheap everything looked. Her words cut through the joy, and guests exchanged awkward glances, trying to ignore the remarks. Nena went to the kitchen and carried out the cake she had baked herself. She had spent long hours practicing until she managed to decorate it with Samto's favorite cartoon character. The children clapped and cheered when they saw it. Samto's eyes sparkled with happiness, but before he could even touch it, Madame Ayanda stepped forward. With a scoff, she picked up the cake and dropped it straight into the trash, her voice sharp as she declared it an embarrassment to the family. The room fell silent. Nena's hands shook, and her heart sank. Samto's face crumbled as tears welled in his eyes. Everyone stared in shock, unable to believe what had just happened. But then, in the midst of the silence, Samto found his courage. His voice was small but firm as he spoke to his grandmother. He said that no matter what she did, she could never throw away his love for his mother. With tiny steps, he went to the kitchen, found a piece of bread, placed a candle on it, and lifted it proudly. He told everyone that this was the best cake, because his mother made it with love. The guests erupted in applause, some wiping tears from their eyes. In that moment, the shame fell on Madame Ayanda instead. Even Obina, Samto's father, stood speechless, realizing how unfair his mother had always been to Nena. Slowly, the celebration turned into a moment of truth. Samto cut the bread with joy, and everyone sang. Nena stood taller, her heart full, knowing that her son's love had turned her humiliation into strength. Her mother-in-law, Madame Ayanda, arrived at the party with her usual arrogance, her steps loud as if the whole place belonged to her. She barely greeted anyone before she started pointing at the decorations with a curled lip. She called the balloons childish, the ribbons untidy, and the chairs too ordinary for a family like theirs. The guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another, while Nena tried to keep a calm face. She had worked so hard to make the day joyful for her son, but every remark from Madame Ayanda felt like a knife cutting through her heart. Instead of joining the celebration, Madame Ayanda walked around the room with her eyes scanning every corner. She complained about the music being too loud, the drinks being too cheap, and even the clothes that Samto wore. She muttered that a grandson of hers deserved more than this shameful little gathering. Her voice carried so everyone could hear, and the joy that had filled the room began to fade. Guests who had been laughing now sat quietly, unsure of what to say. Children who had been playing froze, sensing the tension between the adults. Nena forced a small smile, pretending not to notice the insults, though inside she wanted to cry. She kept serving food, greeting neighbors, and making sure the children had fun. But Madame Ayanda would not stop. She mocked the plates, the food portions, even the drinks that Nena had worked hard to afford. She lifted a plate of jollof rice, sniffed at it, and placed it back down with disgust, muttering loudly about how her son deserved a better wife who could host guests with class. The neighbors glanced at each other, shocked by the cruelty. Some shook their heads, but no one dared to challenge her. The atmosphere felt heavy, and even Samto's excitement dimmed as he watched his grandmother ruin what was meant to be his happiest day. Every word she spoke was like poison, trying to erase all the effort and love that Nena had poured into this day. Still, Nena stayed silent, her trembling hands hidden behind her back, determined not to let her son see her break down. But the guests could not ignore the tension. They knew something unforgettable was about to happen. The arrogance of Madame Ayanda filled the room, and the joy of the party hung by a thread, waiting for the moment when everything would finally turn. Nena stepped into the room carrying a cake, she had baked with her own hands. It wasn't from a fancy bakery, but she had stayed up late nights practicing until she managed to decorate it with Samto's favorite cartoon design. The children's eyes widened as soon as they saw it, colorful and bright, made with love. Samto's face lit up, his small hands clapping with excitement. The guests started clapping too, their cheers filling the room as they admired the effort. They knew it wasn't about money but about the heart of a mother who wanted her child to feel special. The cake sat proudly on the table, and everyone leaned forward to take a closer look. Some of the children pointed at the design, laughing happily, while parents whispered words of praise to each other about how much care Nena had put into it. Samto couldn't stop smiling, his chest swelling with pride that his mother had created something just for him. He looked at her with so much love in his eyes, the kind that only a child who feels cherished could give. For a moment, the room glowed with warmth, as if the cake itself carried joy. Neighbors pulled out their phones, taking pictures of the cake, the little boy, and his beaming mother. The children began chanting for Samto to blow out the candles, and their voices filled the air with excitement. It was the highlight of the party, the moment everyone had been waiting for. Nena's heart raced, not out of fear but from pure happiness. All her hard work and sleepless nights suddenly felt worth it. Samto leaned close, his hands ready to cut into the cake, when the room filled with cheers once again. Some of the women praised Nena openly, telling her that nothing in the world could beat a mother's love. Even those who had been quiet earlier were now smiling and clapping louder, touched by the sight before them. For the first time that day, Nena felt truly appreciated. She wasn't just a wife struggling in silence. She was a mother whose effort was finally noticed. The sound of clapping echoed, children's laughter rang out, and Samto's joy made everything brighter. At that moment, it seemed like nothing could ruin the celebration. The homemade cake stood as a symbol of love, proof that a mother's heart can create magic far greater than money ever could. Madame Ayanda face twisted with disgust the moment her eyes landed on the cake. She stepped forward with a loud scoff, her sharp voice cutting through the joyful claps of the guests. Without a second thought, she leaned over the table, grabbed the carefully decorated cake, and lifted it as if it were nothing. Gasps filled the room, but before anyone could move, she tossed it straight into the trash. Her words came out cold and cruel. "This cheap nonsense is an embarrassment to this family." The sound of her voice echoed, leaving silence heavy in the room. Nena froze, her hands trembling as her eyes followed the cake sinking into the bin. Her heart cracked in that instant. All her sleepless nights, her hours of baking and decorating, were destroyed in one moment of arrogance. Samto's little smile disappeared, his lips quivering as he stared at the empty table. The room that had been full of laughter just moments ago now felt suffocating. Guests stared at each other in shock, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The children stood still, too stunned to move, their excitement turning into confusion. A few of the neighbors whispered in low voices, wondering how a grandmother could humiliate her daughter-in-law in front of everyone. Nena tried to hold herself together, biting her lip to keep tears from falling, but her chest tightened with pain. She wanted to protect her son from this shame, yet she could not stop the storm raging before their eyes. Samto's small hands clenched at his sides, his wide eyes glistening with unshed tears. The moment that should have been his happiest turned into a nightmare. He looked at his mother, his heart breaking at the sight of her standing helpless. The guests waited, hoping someone would speak, but nobody dared to challenge Madame Ayfanda's authority. She stood tall, her chin raised, as if she had done something right, as though her cruelty was justified. The silence was unbearable, heavy enough to drown every sound in the room. Everyone could feel the weight of humiliation pressing on Nena and her son. What was meant to be a celebration of love had turned into public disgrace. Yet beneath the pain, something was building. A moment that no one could have predicted was about to unfold. Guests gasped so loudly that the sound filled the entire room. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if time had stopped. The laughter that had once filled the house vanished instantly, replaced by a silence so heavy that even the smallest sound could be heard. Every pair of eyes turned to Nena, who stood frozen, her hands trembling so much she had to hide them behind her dress. Her face grew pale, and her lips pressed together to keep from breaking down. Inside, her heart ached, but she forced herself to stay strong for her little boy. Samto stood beside her, his tiny frame shaking. His eyes filled with tears that clung to his lashes, threatening to fall. He looked at the empty table where his cake had been moments ago, and then back at his mother. His young mind could not understand why something meant to bring happiness had been destroyed so cruelly. The sparkle in his eyes had dimmed, and his birthday suddenly felt like a punishment instead of a celebration. His small fists clenched tightly, and his chest rose and fell quickly as he tried not to cry in front of everyone. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their faces showing disbelief. Some mothers hugged their children close, whispering about the cruelty they had just witnessed. A few men shook their heads, muttering under their breath, unable to comprehend how a grandmother could humiliate her own family in such a way. The children who had been excitedly waiting to eat the cake stood speechless, their joy stolen in an instant. The atmosphere had turned cold, and the once cheerful decorations now felt like a sad backdrop to a painful scene. Nena's knees weakened, but she refused to collapse. She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears she didn't want her son to see. She had put her entire heart into making this day special for him, and now it had been crushed before everyone's eyes. Still, she held her ground, even as humiliation burned inside her. Her trembling fingers tightened around the edge of her wrapper, her silence speaking louder than words. The quiet was unbearable, stretching longer with each second. Everyone waited, unsure of what would happen next. It was a moment of deep pain, but also the beginning of something unexpected. Beneath the silence, a spark of courage was rising, and the next voice to break the stillness would change everything. "Grandma, you can throw away the cake, but you can't throw away my love for my mother." Samto's little voice echoed through the room, cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. His words were soft, yet they carried a power that no one expected. Every head turned toward him, shocked that such strength could come from a child so young. His back was straight, his eyes wet with tears, but his voice did not shake. In that moment, he stood taller than his years, protecting the one person who meant everything to him. The guests froze, some with their mouths slightly open, others already blinking away tears. They had witnessed humiliation, but now they were watching bravery bloom right before them. Nena gasped quietly, her heart swelling with both pain and pride. She hadn't expected her son to speak, and the weight of his words nearly broke her. She bit her lip, trying to stay strong, but a tear slipped down her cheek anyway. Samto stepped closer to the center of the room, lifting his small chin with determination. He repeated again that nothing in the world could make him stop loving his mother. His eyes shone as he looked directly at Madame Ifienwa, unafraid of her cold stare. The child who moments ago had been trembling was now the bravest one in the room. Guests leaned forward, drawn in by his courage, their hearts pounding at the scene unfolding. Some of the mothers in the crowd whispered softly, their voices trembling with emotion. Fathers shifted in their seats, nodding quietly, touched by the boy's strength. The atmosphere changed instantly. What had been filled with shame now carried a spark of hope. Even the children, who had been silent with confusion, began to smile faintly at the bravery of their friend. Nena's heart raced as she watched her son defend her. She had endured insults for years, but hearing those words from Samto made her realize she was not standing alone. He had given her dignity back in a way she never imagined. Guests began to clap gently at first, then louder, as though encouraging the little hero who had just spoken truth in front of everyone. The power of his words lingered in the air, heavier than anything Madame Ifienwa had said. A child's voice had broken her cruelty, and the entire room felt the shift. Something unforgettable had just happened, and no one could look away. He walks to the kitchen, his little feet moving with a quiet strength that no one expected. The room stayed completely still, all eyes following him as he disappeared behind the door. Guests whispered softly, wondering what the young boy was about to do. A few seconds later, Samto returned, holding a small piece of bread on a plate. Stuck right in the middle was a single candle, crooked but standing proudly. His eyes glowed with determination as he walked back to the center of the room, clutching the plate like it was the most precious thing in the world. The silence broke when he raised the bread high enough for everyone to see. His voice, though gentle, carried clearly across the room. "This is the best cake," he said with pride, "because my mom made it with love." His words struck deep into every heart present. What should have been a sad moment suddenly turned into something unforgettable. Guests who had been holding back tears could no longer hide them. Mothers dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs, fathers nodded in respect, and the children looked on with admiration for their brave friend. Her husband looked at her, confused, and Amara asked him to open the small box on the table. Inside was a set of documents tied neatly with a ribbon. He unfolded them slowly, and his eyes widened in shock. The guests gasped as the papers revealed the truth. The very house they were sitting in, the place where the celebration was happening, belonged to Amara. It had been bought in her name, secured with her inheritance. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some clapped in surprise. Others covered their mouths in disbelief. Madame Ifienwa froze, her proud smile vanishing, her face drained of color. The woman she mocked as rootless was the true owner of the house she boasted about. Guests who once laughed now turned their admiration to Amara, praising her dignity and grace. Amara did not gloat or boast. She simply thanked everyone for celebrating her day. Her calm smile brighter than the candles on her cake. The birthday that began with humiliation ended with respect, leaving Madame Ifienwa silent in her own son's house. The market was busy that morning, filled with the sound of traders calling out prices, women bargaining loudly, and children running between stalls. Amara carried a basket, buying vegetables with a soft smile, greeting people politely as she moved. But peace never lasted long when Madame Ifienwa was near. She appeared suddenly, her voice sharp and angry, drawing attention to herself. Without shame, she began to shout at Amara in front of everyone, her words slicing through the noise of the market. She mocked her loudly, telling anyone who would listen that her son had married a woman who brought no dowry. She pointed at Amara, calling her useless, saying she entered their home empty-handed, without land, without wealth, without even a single meaningful gift. The traders stopped what they were doing, eyes turning to the scene. Some women shook their heads, others whispered to each other, while Madame Ifienwa's voice grew bolder, enjoying the crowd. The humiliation that had crushed her only minutes earlier was gone, replaced with dignity. Her son had turned her weakness into power, and the guests saw it too. They clapped for her as much as they clapped for him, their voices rising as if to say she was no longer alone. Madame Ifienwa, who had thrown the cake away with arrogance, now stood frozen. Her face turned stiff as the attention shifted away from her. Instead of being the respected figure she wanted to be, she now stood as the one who had tried to destroy joy. Guests whispered to each other, shaking their heads, their eyes filled with disapproval as they looked at her. The very moment she thought would embarrass Nena had backfired, leaving her in the shadow of a child's courage. The applause grew louder, almost drowning out everything else. Some neighbors reached out to hold Nena's hand, others hugged Samto, praising him for his strength. The children surrounded him, smiling proudly, chanting his name, and asking him to blow out the candle. The sight was overwhelming, a room filled with love that no insult could erase. Obinna, who had been silent through much of the chaos, shifted uncomfortably. His mother's cruelty had been exposed before everyone, and his wife's quiet strength had finally been recognized. The power in the room had changed, and even he could not deny it. The humiliation no longer rested on Nena's shoulders. It had turned back to Madame Ifienwa, whose arrogance was now seen as cruelty. The crowd's claps and cheers proved one thing: love and respect always rise higher than pride and insults. The turning point came when Samto's words pierced even his father, Obinna. He sat in silence, staring at his son with wide eyes, unable to ignore the truth spoken by a child. The little boy's courage shook him in a way nothing else had before. He thought about the times he had stayed quiet while his mother insulted his wife, the times he had looked away instead of defending her. Now in front of friends, neighbors, and even children, his son had shown more bravery than him. Guilt settled in his chest, heavy and undeniable. Obinna's eyes moved from Samto to Nena, who stood with tears in her eyes but her back straight, holding on to her dignity. He suddenly saw her differently, not just as his wife but as the woman who had sacrificed and endured so much for their family. Her strength had been silent for years, yet here it was, revealed by their son's love. Shame washed over him as he realized he had failed to protect her. His mother's cruelty had gone too far, and now everyone had witnessed it. The guests, still clapping for Samto, began to murmur among themselves, their voices carrying words that Obinna could hear. They praised Nena's patience, admired Samto's courage, and condemned the arrogance of Madame Ifienwa. The respect that should have belonged to his mother now surrounded his wife and child. and it opened his eyes to a truth he could no longer deny. Obinna stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. The room grew quieter as people noticed him rise. His heart raced, but he knew he could not stay silent any longer. Looking at his mother, then at his wife, he felt torn between the woman who raised him and the woman who gave him a family. For the first time, the choice was clear. His son's words had made it impossible to hide from reality. He walked closer to Nena, his face heavy with regret. Though he didn't speak yet, his actions showed a shift everyone could see. Samto's bravery had not only silenced his grandmother's pride, but had also woken his father's conscience. The balance of the family was changing before everyone's eyes. What had begun as a day of humiliation had turned into a moment of truth that could never be forgotten. Nena is finally defended publicly when the voices of the guests rise in her favor. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had once stayed silent now spoke out loudly, praising her patience and love. They called her a true mother, one whose strength had shone brighter than wealth or status. For the first time in years, she did not feel alone. Her husband stood beside her, his face heavy with regret, but his presence showing support that had been missing for too long. The crowd's claps grew louder, and the energy of the room shifted completely. What began as humiliation had turned into honor, and all eyes were now on the woman who had carried her family with quiet dignity. Samto stood in the center, holding the plate with bread and candle, his smile wide and proud. The children surrounded him, chanting for him to cut the bread cake. With a deep breath he leaned forward, his little hands slicing through it as though it were the grandest cake in the world. Cheers erupted, the sound of joy echoing through the room. Guests clapped, some with tears in their eyes, touched by the bravery of a boy and the devotion of his mother. What had been meant as a day of shame became a celebration of love that no one would ever forget. Nena wiped her tears, this time smiling through them, her heart full. She realized she had gained something more powerful than approval. She had earned respect. The humiliation thrown at her had turned into her moment of victory, and it was her son who gave her that gift. Madame Ifienwa stood on the sidelines, her power broken, her arrogance silenced by the truth that love had proven stronger than pride. As the guests sang for Samto and danced around, the home once again filled with happiness. Every clap, every cheer, every smile belonged to Nena too, because the party had become more than a birthday. It had become a testimony of her strength. The night ended not with shame, but with the honor of a mother and the courage of her son. Hi, besties, smiling face with smiling eyes, sparkling heart. Thank you so much for watching this emotional story till the very end. 2 hearts. Please don't forget to like, thumbs up, drop your thoughts in the comments, speech balloon, and subscribe bell for more touching stories. See you in the next one. Sparkles.